Hello and welcome to this workshop. Thank you all for attending. This is a multidisciplinary and interdepartmental workshop focusing on the quantitative and qualitative research in health science. My name is Cotton Coslett. I am the online learning librarian, and I am the subject liaison to the nursing and public health departments. And I'll allow my colleague to introduce himself.
Okay, thank you, Cotton. Okay, my name is Luhua Mahmudu, and I'm assistant professor in the Department of Public Health. We welcome you to this workshop. Thank you very much.
All right, so I want to just briefly review what we'll be discussing in this workshop and sort of the order and format we'll be doing that. We'll be beginning with a focus on quantitative research, discussing what it is, how it can be used, and how it can be located using electronic databases. Then we will turn to qualitative research and roughly follow that same pattern. What is it, how it can be used, and how it can be located using electronic databases. So let's jump right in, and we can start by discussing quantitative research. Quantitative research methods emphasize objective measurements in the statistical, mathematical, or numerical analysis of data. It focuses on gathering numerical data and generalizing it across groups of people or to explain a particular phenomenon. For me, at least, the most important phrase there is numerical data is sort of how I generally think of quantitative research in a broad picture. A good example of this might be something like, what is the relationship between chronic illness and clinical depression? But we also like to think about how quantitative research is gathered. Can be a helpful way of sort of picturing how the methods are used and how this information is gathered. Quantitative research is often gathered using polls, questionnaires, surveys, and it's important to point out that in this case, by surveys, we're referring to controlled choice surveys, such as
Good morning, thank you for calling Will Be Held,
or a Likert scale as well. And oftentimes, quantitative research is based on pre-existing data sets, and those are subjected to statistical analysis. There are some characteristics of quantitative research. One is that, as I mentioned here, data is in the form of numbers and statistics, often arranged in tables. That does not mean to say that any article with tables or charts is quantitative. However, quantitative data is usually expressed best using tables and charts and non-textual forms. I will pass over to my colleague.
Okay, so I take over from Cotton. So now we are going to look at the types of quantitative research. You know, I have already introduced you to what quantitative research is. So what are some of the types of quantitative research we might be looking at? So first of all, you might all know about descriptive. Now, when we look at a descriptive quantitative research, we are looking at a description of attribute within a population. Yeah, so for any given health data, you might want to look at what are the descriptive of attribute or characteristics within the data. And there's quite often something which have been used when it comes to collecting quantitative research. So another type of quantitative research is the causal comparison. So this type of research is actually looking at comparing variables, given variables of a quantitative data. So when it comes to this causal comparison, you might want to know the cause and effect of these variables. And this causal comparison specifically have one variable, which is the dependent variable, which is sometimes also called the outcome or the target variable. And then you have the other variables, which is known as the independent variable, which is sometimes referred to as the predictor or maybe the covariate. Some people call it the attributable variable or the contributable variable, whichever way you would want to call it, that's fine. So we are just looking at establishing some cause and effect between these variables, and that gives us a causal comparison research in quantitative research. And also we have a survey. Survey is something everyone knows about, you know, being able to collect information about attributes within a given population. You know, so survey is usually carried out. We have the online survey, we have the questionnaire system of survey, we have the polling type of survey, you know, where you get mails in your mailbox where asking you several questions. Even when it comes to even recent COVID-19, there were several surveys about individual response to the COVID-19 vaccines. And these are examples you might think of. Then also we have the correlational quantitative research. Now, correlation is coming from relationship. So this correlational research is actually looking at establishing relationship between the variables. So you might have a number of independent variables, and you might want to know, are there any relationship between them? Let's say, for instance, if you look at high blood pressure, and then let's say the blood sugar level or glucose level. So you might want to know, is there any relationship between the high blood pressure and the blood sugar level or glucose? So you can't use this correlational research to do that. Then it is not only between independent variable, you can also establish a correlation between dependent variable and then other independent variable as well. Then also we have experimental research. This, when we talk about experimental research, now what comes into our mind is an experiment. And when it comes to experiment, we say the investigators have an absolute control over the subjects in which are participating in this research. And an example of experimental research you might know is the clinical trial. So every clinical trial is an example of experimental research you might think of. So now let us look at a broad scope of the type of quantitative research. So over here we have the conclusive and then the exploratory. Now I will talk a little bit about the exploratory before coming to the conclusive, because it has more to. So when we talk about the exploratory quantitative research, you are digging deep about a particular subject within a particular field of study. So an example is the pilot survey. Pilot survey is a clear example of when it comes to exploratory research. And exploratory research dig deep into finding so much information about the subjects as compared to when it comes to conclusive research. Now, in the conclusive research, it is being split into two, which is the descriptive or the causal. Now, the descriptive is what we know about the case study research, the case series. We have the cross-sectional, the longitudinal or cohort study, and then we have the retrospective. Now, we know the case study is the study of a single disease individual. Then the case series is studying multiple disease individuals. And then when we talk about the cross-sectional study, it's a study about the determinants of or attributes of individual within a population. And longitudinal study look at actually a follow-up study, right? And then just like a cohort study where you follow individual up. Now, a cohort study actually gives you two types, which we can have the retrospective and that of the prospective. Now, retrospective is usually called the historical data. And then prospective is when you have individuals and then you follow them up into the future to see, for instance, the individual may be exposed to a particular content. You follow them up into the future to see whether the exposure leads to a disease. Then you have the causal type of the conclusive part of the quantitative research, which again, we have the experimental and then the quasi-experimental. Now, the difference between these two is the fact that with the experimental, the investigator have a total control over the subject. For us in a quasi-experimental, the investigator have some control over the subject and not a total control. And quasi-experiment usually happen in a very large population where it is having a heterogeneous features. So now let's look at some examples of quantitative data. Like Cotton said, quantitative data talks about numerics or numbers. So you might think about money, time, speed, movement, height, distance, length, volume, the BMI, that's the body mass index, the blood sugar level, the amount of white blood cell, the hemoglobin level. Now, these are all examples of quantitative data. Now, let us look at why are we studying, do we even need a quantitative research? Now, this is a very 4 key reasons why quantitative research is useful. So to study the pattern or averages, now you might want to know that, let's say, given a group of individuals with high blood pressure, you might want to know what is the average high blood pressure for this age group. And you might also maybe want to study some patterns. Let's say there's a disease outbreak, for instance, COVID-19 disease outbreak. And then you might want to know what is the patterns in terms of the changes in the number of individuals who are being infected or diagnosed with COVID-19. So over time, you might want to then also to make prediction. Now, that is a very key importance of quantitative research because it is looking at establishing cause and effect. So you might want to use it in making what a prediction. So a prediction you might think of, for example, you might want to ask yourself that does the glucose level of an individual predict the blood pressure of the individual, which is an example. For instance, does the cholesterol level of an individual predict the blood pressure level of the individual? So these are some of the predictions you might want to make. And then also it tests the causal relationship. So what is the causal relationship? Does glucose have impact on the blood pressure of an individual? Does cholesterol have impact on the blood pressure of the individual? So this is the causal relationship we want to establish. Then also to generalize the results to a wider population. Now, more often, this research actually deals with sample rather than the entire population. So at the end of the day, we would want to actually base on the sample to make a generalization to the entire population. And there's just an expansion of some of these importance. It allows us to assess the causal relationship and effects on the outcome variable, then also test the strength and significance of a phenomenon. So when we talk about the strength and significance of a phenomenon, you might want to know how significant does the blood sugar level of an individual impact the blood pressure of the individual. So for instance, how significant is the number of time an individual undertake a physical activity impact the body mass index of the individual, which lead to obesity. So these are some of the significant you might think. Then also to measure the data and then also show results on the objective. Then to investigate the reliability and the accuracy of the outcome. That's what makes quantitative research more important. It allows you to be able to actually measure the accuracy. So if you look at those of you who might have learned a little bit about regression, it allows you to have something like the R-square, which is measuring the variation in the outcome variable, which is being explained by the independent variable. So what is this R-square? The higher the R-square you make, the more accurate in terms of its prediction, and which become very key in terms of, and the more reliable your identify risk factors become. Then also it allows us to assess the relationship and then association between the variables and the factors. Then also to make forecast or to make prediction. If you take linear regression, for instance, it allows us to make what prediction for the future, given the identify what risk factors, which is become very important. Then also to assess pattern and then phenomenon over time. So now let us look at also furthermore on how to use quantitative research. Now there are basic procedures in terms of when it comes to making use of quantitative research. What are these procedures? The first procedure is to make observation about something unknown. Now, before you proceed with a quantitative research, the first thing you do is to make an observation. For instance, maybe you might be a medical doctor, and then you observe that people who walk into the hospital and are being diagnosed by hypertension, most of them are the aged group or the adult group, let's say 65 plus. This is the initial observation you make. So based on the observation, you might want to actually embark to investigate how true is this observation. Is it true that hypertension is associated with the aged group? So this is the initial observation. Then you formulate the hypothesis. So based on the observation, now you can formulate the hypothesis. So the hypothesis, for instance, become, let's say, hypertension is associated with what? The aged group, or people who are aged, let's say 65 plus, are more likely to be diagnosed with hypertension. So this becomes a hypothesis an individual may formulate. Then also you predict the outcomes. So before you proceed with your investigation, you should be able to know the outcome, because you are looking at the outcome become, let's say, the disease. So for instance, if you look at hypertension, what outcome are we going to look at? We are looking at the blood pressure level of the individual. That becomes the outcome. And that is what we are actually going to base on to test and to perform our further analysis or investigation. Then also, now you know your outcome. You know, let's say the blood pressure level is the outcome for the hypertension. Now you want to collect data about the blood pressure level. So you collect all necessary data which you think can contribute to what the blood pressure level of an individual, which can lead to hypertension. So you might want to collect data on the glucose level, maybe the cholesterol level, maybe the number of times the individual actually exercise during the week or take part in physical activity. Then also, if now finally, after you have gathered your information, if your prediction is confirmed, verify the results and then draw a final conclusion. Now, if you're able to confirm your results, if you're able to validate the results and then have a higher accuracy, then you have to make your conclusion about the finding. Now, if it is not confirmed, then there is a need for you to formulate a new hypothesis. Perhaps your initial observation in which you based on to formulate your hypothesis is not actually a good observation you made. Hence, you think of another different way to actually approach your analysis. Now, let us look at, now you have an idea when it comes to quantitative research. Now, let us look at let's try to link the type of quantitative research to some examples you might want. So, for instance, we have the descriptive quantitative research. So, an example of it is, for instance, if NIH survey 5,000 individuals who receive COVID-19 vaccine, and then compiling a description of this individual experience with the vaccine. It's an example of descriptive. And it's an ongoing investigation by several health departments. They want to know how the vaccine is impacting individuals. Then what about the correlational research of quantitative? Now you would want to, for instance, studying the relationship between the blood pressure and then the amount of blood sugar level or the amount of glucose intake for hypertension patient. This allows you to be able to establish whether there's any relationship between the blood pressure level and then the amount of glucose level the individual take, leading to hypertension. Then also we have the experimental. So testing whether or not an intervention or treatment prevents or reduce disease. So an example is, let's think about COVID-19. I'm using COVID-19 because it's a more recent disease, and I think that gives you a more clearer understanding. So we have the COVID-19 vaccine, for instance. So before these companies came up with the vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson and Co., what they wanted to know is whether their vaccine is capable of preventing an individual from being diagnosed with COVID-19. And it went through several clinical trials, which is basically an example of this experimental research. Then also we have the comparative, for instance, measuring the effect of plant dietary meal on diabetic patient for a year. Now, what makes this one a comparative research? You might want to know whether one group of individuals who have diabetes and another group of individuals. So you put one group of the individual into a plant dietary meal, and then the other just take ordinary meal. And then at the end of the day, you come to compare and see, does those who were kept into a plant dietary meal have a reduction in the incidence of diabetes as compared to those who were not put in a plant dietary meal? So this becomes a comparative research. And the comparative research, a case control study, for example, is an example of a comparative research where you have the cases and then you have the control. Then also we have the statistical tools which you can actually use for a quantitative data. Let's start with the descriptive tool. Some of the descriptive tool you can use for quantitative data is we have the measurement of the center of the data, which is the mean, the median, and then the mode. So you would want to actually know the center of what is the mean, what is the median of your data. Then also you would want to measure the spread or the dispersion. Now you would want to know what is the variability within my data set. Is the data skewed? In the standard deviation, if you have a higher standard deviation, then it tells you there is more spread between your data points and then the mean value of your data. So if that happens, it means there's something have to be done. Then you might also want to, we have the interquartile, which is the difference between the third quarter and then the first quarter, which they are all example. And then also we have the range. quite often when it comes to health research, they actually want you to make mention of the standard deviation and then also the range of the data. So if you go through several research articles, these are some of the important descriptive you can see. Then also we have the 5 number summary, which is actually can be seen from the box plot over here, which is also measuring the minimum, the first quarter, the median, the third quarter, and then the maximum of the data, and as well as the outlier. So outlier observation that distance itself from the entire data set. And when you have outlier within a data, it's something you have to take extra look at because it can influence your conclusions. Then also we have outliers. So these are how you can actually calculate outliers by using the first quartile, the interquartile rate, and the third quartile in calculating the outliers. So now let's look at some graphical display as a tool for quantitative research. You have the histogram, which you can actually use in assessing the distribution, the normal distribution of your data. Is the data skewed? If it is skewed, is it right skewed or left skewed? If it is a uniform data, it means all the data points are the same. So you might want to check some of this information. Then also we have the box plot, which is also used in assessing again the distribution of the data, which performs similar role like the histogram. Then we have the scatter plot, which is used in assessing the relationship between 2 quantitative variables. So you might, for instance, we spoke about the blood sugar level and then the blood pressure level of the individual. So you might want to plot a simple scatter plot to see their relationship. Are they having a positive relationship, a negative relationship, or they don't have any relationship? The scatter plot can give you a visualization of it. Then also we have a line plot, which is actually also used in assessing relationship or pattern over time. So you might want to know perhaps how does the prevalence of the disease changes over time? How does the prevalence of COVID-19 changes over time? We know there have always been ups and downs in terms of the number of individuals who are being diagnosed with COVID-19. And by using a line plot, it can actually help you assess how is this changing happening over time. Now, let's also finally look at some statistical tools or methods that we can actually use in performing some inference when it comes to quantitative analysis. One of them you can have is we have the sample or one sample test. Yeah, for instance, if you made an observation, the fact that, let's say, individuals who are being diagnosed with, let's say, hypertension, if you made an observation that their high blood pressure level, let's say the diastolic is greater than 110, there's an observation you made. So you might want to proceed to perform a test to see whether this observation is true, that's to prove or disprove it. Then also you have a 2-sample test, there are 2-sample independent tests. So this type of test actually is having one variable, which is a categorical variable, which have in which the variables are independent. For instance, let's say you have one variable as male and female, and then you have another variable which is a continuous variable or the quantitative variable, as let's say the blood pressure. So you might want to know if there are differences between the blood pressure level of a male and then the female. Let's say there are differences between the blood pressure level of the aged group and then the young group. You can use the 2-sample test. Then we also have the ANOVA, which allow you to actually make several tests to know the mean differences between more than 3 independent categorical variables. That's if you have a categorical variable that is having more than 2 categories, then you can actually use the ANOVA to assess their mean differences. Then also you have the paired sample t-test. The paired sample t-test is very useful, particularly when it comes to, now it is a test which is measured on the same subjects. So for instance, you push a group of individuals through a physical training, and then you might want to know before and after the physical training, what is their maybe the impact it have in terms of, let's say, their obesity level, which is their BMI level, or maybe their blood pressure level, that before the intervention and after the intervention. Then also you have the correlation coefficient, which is again using to measure the relationship. Now the correlation coefficient it's between -1 and 1. 1 means a perfect negative correlation. That's -1 means a perfect negative correlation. 1 means a perfect positive correlation. And usually a correlation of greater than, people do consider correlation greater than 6 as a strong correlation. And then 0 means there is no correlation. Then you have this regression analysis again, which is going to allow you to measure the cause and effect between the dependent variable and then other independent variable. Then you have the time series, which is allowing you to assess the trend over time given a number of risk factors. So it is allowing you to make a prediction for an outcome variable given a number of risk factor over time. So these are some of the tools which you can actually use in performing any quantitative research you have. Okay, so I leave you to my colleague, Kochi.
Thank you. Thank you, Lula. So we've just learned a whole lot about quantitative research and what it is and how it can be used. Unfortunately, finding this research in databases is not always a very simple task. And so I'm going to offer some suggestions and guidance on strategies and how to sort of identify these things and how to locate them within databases. There are some databases which have built-in features which allow you to really hone in on those and pull those up and be able to get use from them. But obviously there's many different kinds of database, and some of them do not have those features. So I'm going to begin by discussing how best to search for quantitative research on databases that don't necessarily have those features, such as OneSearch or Google Scholar, sort of the general keyword searching databases. And that's kind of how I'll refer to those. When you don't have the ability to search for something as a subject or as a specific type of limiter, then we're going to be using keyword searches. And so the first keyword that comes to mind is the one that I see most frequently used by many of the students I work with, and that is to enter quantitative. And this is not without its worth. Using quantitative as a keyword will bring back some results, especially that first page of results, that first, the most relevant ones will be helpful. However, it can be somewhat problematic because it will bring back, a lot of time when we're using keyword searches, we're essentially asking for every article or resource with that word in it. And that obviously is not always going to be very helpful. So instead, I suggest considering related terms. Quantitative is kind of used as a catch-all. So using terms like validity, variance, correlation, and statistical analysis can be extremely helpful in reducing your results to those specific types of research. Statistical analysis in particular is one that I find to be very helpful. Another thing to consider while you're using these databases as a keyword searching is how this research is gathered. As we mentioned earlier, polls, questionnaires, and surveys can be an extremely helpful way to sort of make sure you're getting that gathering method in the results that you're getting back. And as Lahua mentioned, there's also specific tools used in quantitative analysis. Searching with these as keywords can also be quite helpful. Terms such as t-test, ANOVA can be quite useful. Regression analysis in particular, again, is something that it's very specific, but it will bring back considerable amounts of results, all using that specific type of analysis. And so, as I mentioned, those are the keyword searching strategies I tend to employ, but there are other databases which have more robust features and allow us to really focus on specific types of research. And I'm going to pull up a browser now, and we're going to take a look at some of these databases in real time. Okay, so what we're looking at right here is CINAHL Plus with full text. This is a medical and nursing database. It is very commonly used, and it probably looks somewhat familiar and will, again, when we get to the next database. Now, all of the strategies I've already suggested are perfectly usable here in keyword searches. We see we have these three windows on the top where we can certainly enter in the terms we're searching for. I would recommend, rather than leaving this at select a field, which will look through the entire article, you might decide you want to say, look for, if I'm searching for, say, variance, I'm going to have much greater success if I'm searching in, say, just the abstracts for the term variance rather than the entire article. Those keyword searches work great here, but like I said, there's also some other functions. One thing we can do is scroll down to publication type right here. This publication type limiter obviously has a large number of options in here, and some of these are going to be quite useful to us. Things like clinical trial, and I can also hold down control and select as many of these as I like. And I might say clinical trial and randomized controlled trial and statistics. And so once that I have these selected, I can just scroll to the bottom and click search and be given everything they have in this database that fall under those publication types. Or I might choose to go back up and enter in keywords that are going to steer these results a little bit towards my topic and not just the type of research that we're looking for. The publication type has a lot of options in there. Some of them are going to be more helpful than others, but there's also something of a time saver. And forgive me, I'm going to get out of that for a moment. And if I scroll down a slight half page more, we see there's also a checkbox for randomized controlled trials. Selecting this is going to make sure that any results we get back are going to be featuring randomized controlled trials. And like I said earlier, I don't need to even enter keywords. I can start my search looking for randomized controlled trials. And normally I wouldn't get that message. So give me just a moment here. I select it here and search. It should stop and think for a moment and then bring us back 141,000 randomized controlled trials. So I definitely recommend using some keywords in addition to that, because these will be about every topic they can possibly find. Going back to the main page, I've shown you a few of these limiters that are here on this main advanced search page, which is the landing page for this database. But there are also other options. And in this case, I'm talking specifically about using subject terms. As I mentioned, when we use a keyword, we're generally searching in either the whole article or a specific part of the article for that term. However, when I check this box, suggest subject terms, suddenly this database is no longer looking for articles. It's looking for medical subject headings that it can use to apply to these articles. And in this case, I might try something very general like quantitative. And when I click search, it's not going to give me a list of articles with the word quantitative, but it's rather going to give me a list of subjects that we can use. And we see right at the top, it's actually telling us quantitative studies is what we prefer to use in this database. So I can click on this and be taken to information all about quantitative studies and get a look at that there. And as you can see, it sort of falls under the hierarchy of study design, which is useful. But what I can also do is check this box right next to quantitative studies. And when I do that, we see on the right side of the screen, we have a whole bunch of subheadings open up, or I can just begin to search the database. And when I do that, now it's giving us all of the quantitative studies that they have listed. And obviously we see there's only 31,000 of these, which is a lower number than we saw of the randomized controlled trials. But it's important to think about when we're using these subject headings that they're focusing on the act of quantitative research as much as using it within the article themselves. So they'll be weighing different methods of analysis and focusing on that as a subject as much as a research method. Okay, so we are now looking at APA PsycInfo, which is a psych and mental health database focusing on that side of the medicine. Now, we saw a bunch of varieties in CINAHL Plus of different ways we can narrow these down. Fortunately for us, APA PsycInfo actually has a much more pertinent limiter in here, and that is under methodology. So once I'm here, I can look under methodology, and we see a number of different types of methodologies listed here, which are helpful. But I can scroll all the way to the bottom, and we have qualitative and quantitative studies. So I can select quantitative study and then click search. And that's going to bring us to the near 2 million results that are falling under the heading of quantitative studies. Now, obviously, we would want to use keywords to narrow these down a little bit further. But one thing we can do, one thing that I'm very excited about within APA PsycInfo is that in addition to looking at methodologies, we can also look up tests and measures. So this allows us to find multiple articles using the same methodology that are also happening to use the same tests and measures, which make them even more comparable and easier to use in analysis. The last database I'd like to show you for this is PubMed. And PubMed obviously looks quite a bit different than the other two databases. And it is just as usable as a keyword search database as CINAHL Plus is, as APA PsycInfo is. However, CINAHL Plus does have a few helpful uses as well. Now, like I said, we can use the keywords, but just like in CINAHL Plus, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to select Mesh Database. And this allows me to use the medical subject headings to my advantage rather than using keywords. And so in this case, I might try searching for quantitative. However, I already know that that won't yield any results. So I might try searching for statistics. And this isn't perfect, but what we do find is statistics as a topic. And when I click statistics as a topic, this gives us a lot more information. It tells us about the general definition here, and we are given subheadings as well. But if I scroll down, we're given a much better idea of what is included under statistics as a topic. Now, some of these are not necessarily entirely quantitative, but we are seeing quite a few of these that we saw with when Woohoo was discussing the different types of quantitative research. For instance, we see regression analysis right here. And so we might choose to focus on this by selecting on it. And now we're taken to a very similar page, only focusing on regression analysis. And if I'm interested in pulling up these results, I can go over here to the search builder, click add to search builder, and then search. And I've gotten back about 500,000 results based on using regression analysis. Now, one other thing that we can do here is continue to narrow these down by article type. We see that we have a number of different article types available to us. However, we can also just go into additional filters and add more. And we see, one thing you might notice is that there's a number of different clinical trial options here. Now, these are all clinical trials in specific phases. However, there's also clinical trial on the main page, and that's going to include all of those at once. So don't feel like you need to pull more in. Clinical trial tends to be very illustrative and cover a lot of those bases as well. And so as you can see, we can narrow these down quite easily that way. And so those are the specific databases I wanted to show using this type of search. However, keep in mind the keyword searches are going to be useful as well, and they can be used across just about any database you find. I'm going to get us back into the PowerPoint, and I will turn it over to Lua.
Okay, so now my colleague Cotton have actually show you the various databases in which you have to actually go to be able to collect a quantitative data. Now let us look at something on qualitative data. So again, he's going to start on qualitative data.
Thank you. I just needed a quick break. So qualitative research is the next type of research we're looking at here. And obviously, what is it? So qualitative research, it's an umbrella phrase that describes many research methodologies often used to discover and gain an in-depth knowledge of individual experiences, thoughts, and opinions. And for me personally, the experiences, thoughts, and opinions is really sort of what underlines what I think of when I think of qualitative research. And so what's an example of that? How is clinical depression experienced by members of different ethnicities? This is something, again, think of thought, think of experiences, perceptions, beliefs, things like that. So how is it gathered? Again, this is a great way to think about qualitative research or quantitative research and the methods in which this data is collected. And unlike quantitative data, a lot of qualitative research is collected through observation, through interviews, through focus groups. Think these are, along with surveys, open-ended surveys, these are open-ended. So they allow participants to voice, in their own words, what they're experiencing and what their experiences are. Occasionally, secondary research is also used in qualitative research in the form of text, video, images as well. And so what are characteristics of qualitative research? One, as I just mentioned, would be the open-ended responses to questions, being given free language responses, certainly indicative of qualitative research. Data collection is also frequently done in a natural setting, as opposed to, say, in a laboratory. So if I'm conducting a workplace observation, I'm going to be in the workplace observing rather than in a different setting. And typically, qualitative research works to build a narrative showing a holistic picture of the issue. Okay.
Okay, all right, thank you. So now, now you know about what a qualitative research is. Now let us look at what are some of the types of qualitative research. Now, if you think about performing a qualitative research, what should you do? Now, one qualitative research we have is the one-on-one interview. Maybe something most of you might have been doing, but you are not aware. That is an example of qualitative research. If you go to the hospital and then you are on one-on-one with the medical doctor, now he do collect some information from you, and whatever information is collecting from you from this one-on-one interview is an example of qualitative research you can get. Then also we have focus group. Now also focus group is also another type of qualitative research tool we can actually use in gathering qualitative information or data. Again, it's also something most of you are already engaged in. An example, the project group assignments, and then others you do engage yourself. It's an example of focus group research work. And so mostly focus group may entail about 5 to 10 individuals who actually sit down and dissect deeply into issues relating to health, dissecting into health issues. Then also we have the ethnographic research. Maybe this a type of research most of you might not be fully aware of. So this type of research is actually focused on a specific geographic area. Now we know, for instance, if you think about, let's say, Ebola, we know Ebola outbreak happened in Republic of Congo, somewhere in Republic of Congo. And within that geographic area, they were able to contain it. And then researchers actually embark on research knowing what actually happened and gathering information regarding this Ebola. There is an example of what ethnographic research, where it is focused on a specific geographic area or environment. Then we also have a case study. So this a case study research is actually a study which is focusing on a particular disease individual. Now, in a case study research, it's something which is actually focused on diseases that are uncommon. For instance, if you take a disease like autism, autism is an example of a disease which is not very common in our society. But however, given that people do get diagnosed with autism, sometimes researchers might want to focus on this autism individual to know more about, their progresses in terms of certain characteristics or features that comes up in as their diseases progresses or they seek for treatment. Then also record keeping. Okay, I know everyone knows about record keeping. Record keeping at the hospital is an example of quantitative research. If you go to the hospital, your information about the type of insurance you are using, and then any other more information which is being collected about this individual is an example of quantitative research, which is also being used in the health science. Then this is the very quantitative research in which I think everyone knows, which is the observational research. Now, this observational research comes with what? When we say observational research, what do we actually mean by observational research? We know it is a research in which the investigator or the researcher have no influence on the subject. It's not able to manipulate the subjects, right? Or what he does is just stand by and then collect the data or observe whatever is going on. Survey is an example of observational research, cross-sectional study in which interviewing and then others, these are all examples of what observational study, which actually is being carried more often when it comes to gathering information for health research. Now, let us also look at some example of qualitative data. So we have verbal or written feedback. Now, one example of qualitative data is a verbal or written feedback. So what do we mean by verbal or written feedback? Sometimes you might want to know feedback about patients, right? Feedback of people who have been diagnosed with a specific, diseases. Feedback of individual who took, let's say, a specific type of a vaccine for COVID-19, let's say whether the Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer. You might want to have certain feedback. Was it having any complication on the patients and then others? These are all examples of quantitative research, qualitative research examples you can get. Then also we have narrative. So sometimes, more often, if you are sick and you go to the hospital, what happened? It's an example of one-to-one interview, which is a type of qualitative research. But what happened is you as a patient, you start narrating your story, telling the doctor, okay, I waked up, I was having headache, I was having this and that and that. And based on your narrative or your narration, the doctor is able to tell perhaps maybe you are diagnosed with this, or maybe you have to go to the lab for further tests and then others. And there's a narrative type of example of qualitative research. Now, when it comes to narrative, we have the first-hand narrative, which involves a direct experience, that the individual himself. Then we have the second-hand, which involves a person who is watching from elsewhere. Perhaps maybe a parent may send their child or daughter to the hospital, and then they would have to tell the doctor, okay, this is what my child is experiencing, or maybe for some reason, let's say all of a sudden somebody collapsed, and then the person might not know what happened before the incident happened. So when they get to the hospital, whoever was somebody who was standing by and then saw whatever happened before this incident happened might want to give a narration, and there's an example of what a qualitative research. Then also we have a third party. Now, sometimes there are certain diseases. You may have certain medical doctors who have some experience in terms of handling such diseases, or maybe they have had encounter with individuals who were diagnosed with such a disease. So they might be invited to give certain narration of how perhaps to go about in terms of gathering information about this disease. And that's, again, a qualitative example of data. Then we have visual images. I think once I talk of visual images, the first thing comes to your mind is X-ray, right? X-ray is a visual images. You go, if you have any, you might want to go for scanning, for maybe mammogram or others. These are all examples of what virtual images you might see, which is an example of qualitative data you might have. Then also we have other description like the appearance, beauty, belief, capabilities, choices, color, desirability, distinguish, encouragement, your feelings, and then fitness level, significance, smell, strength. All these are examples of qualitative data you can think of. So now let us think about why do we even need a qualitative data? Now, in a qualitative data, it actually helps to explore, go deep, and then seek to understand. So in a given population, you might want to understand what is actually happening in the population. Let's say, for instance, COVID-19, there was a COVID-19 outbreak, and researchers want to know more about what is happening within the population. And what are some of the things they might want to consider? Okay, within the age group, which group are more at risk of being infected by COVID-19? Now, within the age group, which group are less at risk of being infected by COVID-19? And even apart from the age group, you might want to think of, let's say, if you take the state of California and the state of, let's say, Tennessee, which of these states is at high incidence in terms of the COVID-19? These are some of the things you might want to dig deep to understand. And then by understanding, it helps us to come up with certain policy intervention in handling such diseases. So to assess the frequency of traits and then characteristics of a particular data case. Yeah, so through qualitative research, we are able to actually know how frequently is this happening. So once we talk about frequently, the very term in which it's quite used often in health is prevalence. So how prevalence is the disease within our population? If the prevalence the prevalence can actually give us a clue of whether this particular disease is even, let's say, endemic, is it epidemic, is it a pandemic, right? So COVID-19 became a pandemic, worldwide pandemic disease because it's what? Because it is having a high prevalence rate and it is all over around the globe. Hence, it was called a pandemic. So there's how we can actually measure these things, the usefulness. Then also, now what you should know about qualitative research, how important is it is quantitative research can actually be represented in a qualitative form. Now think about it this way. For instance, let's say you might want to say that, oh, okay, age is a risk factor for hypertension or maybe high blood pressure. But wait a minute. If you say age is a risk factor, how sure are you? In order to go a little bit deep in which qualitative research gives you that strength is to know the age group. So what about if I categorize the age group into different categories? Let's say individuals less than 24, let's say 24 to 35, maybe between 45 and let's say 65 plus. So now I put them into groups. Now it allows me to really deeply understand which actually group is at high risk. So qualitative research actually gives us this information. So at the end of the day, you are able to know that, okay, although age is a risk factor for hypertension, but wait a minute, it's not all group of age, but instead perhaps out of your research, individuals 65 plus are more at risk of being diagnosed with, let's say, hypertension as compared to those that are less. And that gives you a more insightful information to be able to make a decision that is still making a very strong policy intervention. Then also you have to investigate connection association among categorical variables. Now, through qualitative research, you are able to actually establish association between categorical variables. So for instance, you might want to know that, okay, you ask people, you were able to actually group, let's say, the body mass index of an individual into two, where you have one group considered to be obese and then the other group considered not to be obese. Quite often, if you have a body mass index of greater than or equals to, let's say, 30, you are being considered as obese. So you have these two groups. Then you might want to maybe establish the fact that does maybe the cholesterol level of an individual have impact on the obesity? Or maybe is there any relationship between the cholesterol level of an individual and then obesity? Then also you have this cholesterol level also grouped into categories, or maybe does age categories have any association with individuals who are obese? So these are some of the associations you can actually come up with through a qualitative research. Then also to assess the extent or the magnitude of the risk factor or association of attributes on the outcome variable. Now, for instance, if I come to you and then I tell you that, look, not having enough physical activity is associated with obese. And perhaps there's a research which is actually backing it. And that's a good information based on the research. Let's say there's some evidence out there. But then it even becomes more informative if I tell you that, okay, not having physical activity have increased risk of being obese. Now, the first statement was not having physical activity is associated with obese. But now I'm telling you, it has an increased risk of being obese if you don't have a physical activity. That's also another, even a more important information than the first one. Then also another thing is, okay, now I'm not only telling you not having physical activity has increased risk of being obese, but then not having physical activity have, let's say, 60% increased risk of being obese. Now I'm being more specific. Then it tells you that, wait a minute, if I don't have physical activity, I have 60% chances of being obese. Now it gives you more information to actually plan your life. But if I tell you not having physical activity have, let's say, 5% of being obese, someone will say, oh, okay, give me a break. I'll eat all the kind of sandwich I want to eat and I'm okay because it's just 5% chance and perhaps I don't fall within that 5% group. So there's how important a qualitative research can actually be, giving you a more deeper information to be able to actually make certain conclusions. Then also let us look at how to use a qualitative research. Now, qualitative research can take a variety of forms. Now, one of the forms is content analysis. Now, there's something we are all pretty much used to, which is actually performing certain hypotheses and then reviewing the theme or information that emerged after categorizing or summarizing or tabulating the data. And there's something which is quite used more often. So maybe you might not know the analysis you perform out of a qualitative data. Maybe you might not know it's actually a content analysis, and that's an example of how a qualitative research can be used. Then also we have the framework analysis, which involve organizing the data, the teams, then coding, charting, and then mapping and interpreting them. Now, this framework analysis is even also more important when it comes to particular, if you take an example, for instance, mapping. Now, when there is a COVID-19 outbreak, when policymakers are coming up with some policy intervention in terms of, let's say, how to distribute the vaccine. Now, you wouldn't want to distribute a vaccine or send more vaccine to an environment where the incidence of the COVID-19 or the prevalence of COVID-19 is very low, as compared to an environment where the incidence of the COVID-19 is much. So you use mapping to be able to locate which area is the prevalence of the COVID-19 high. Then more medications or vaccine is being sent there, and that actually will be able to help to reduce the incidence of the COVID-19. So there's an example of the framework analysis. And then also we have a case study. Again, case study I did explain earlier on, to dig deep into understanding a particular disease individual and to learn more about that disease. Then also more on how to use qualitative research. Let us take an example. For instance, let's say a health insurance company is asking the question, why are customers leaving? And to restate the question, you say which factors are causing the customers to leave. So some of the qualitative research you might want to review is asking reasons why customers are discontinuing the service, which is an example of qualitative research. Then also you ask the staff, why do they think customers are leaving, which also gives you a qualitative research. Then also you look at past experience, customer, client, and then communication prior to leaving. So you would want to know about some of the complaints of the customers and their communication prior to leaving, which also give you some qualitative research. Then also you might want to survey current customers to determine their level of satisfaction. How satisfied are they with this type of insurance? If it is a public insurance, if it is a private insurance, how satisfied are they? It gives you a qualitative information. Then also feedback mechanism to collect ideas and then comments from customers, staff, and other stakeholders. So you might also want to look about and then also collect information. For instance, some information you might collect, for instance, when it comes to, let's say, health insurance company, you might want to know why is this health insurance company actually surviving or progressing or advancing, you know. So you might want to, and these become an example of stakeholders you might want to get some information from. Then also some company culture evaluation. So you might want to evaluate the culture of the company. Now let us look at another illustration using COVID-19. So which is a bigger question in which some of you might have asked yourself, why are people refusing to take COVID-19 vaccine? Now, you know, COVID-19, we know the number of deaths COVID-19 have caused, how fast is it, the number of individuals who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 over the years. And now, thankfully, there have been a vaccine, but people are still refusing the vaccine. So the question is, why are they refusing? So you might want to know which risk factors influence the likelihood of people receiving vaccine, or which risk factors influence the likelihood of people refusing the vaccine. And the qualitative data you can actually look at is people feeling about being vaccinated. Yeah, so perhaps there could be some reason behind why people are not taking the vaccine. So you have to actually assess their feeling, their emotions, and then based on which you can use it for some certain policy intervention. Then also people feeling about the likelihood of contracting COVID-19. Now, for instance, if I think that the likelihood of contracting COVID-19 is very minimal for the youth, then the youth are less likely to take COVID-19 anyway. And if it is, the risk of contracting COVID-19 is very high for the aged group, then it's more likely you get the aged group taking the COVID-19 vaccine. And there's an example of qualitative data you can actually look at, the feeling of people, the likelihood of people contracting COVID-19. Then also you look at individual perception about the vaccine type. So we have different type of vaccine. What are individual perception? Perhaps what are some of the complications after people have taken the vaccine? What are some of the adverse effects after people taking vaccine? Because there were so many conspiracy theories, particularly when it came to some of these types of vaccine when initially they discovered the vaccine. So you might want to know more about that. Then also a survey of people who have vaccinated to determine their level of satisfaction and then their health condition. So this also be able, if a lot of people who took the vaccine is actually giving a high level of satisfaction, then based on that data, you can use it as a motivation to get a lot more people to also get vaccine. If more people out who were vaccinated are saying, oh, they are having a very good health condition, they are having excellent health condition, then based on it, you can use it as a means to motivate people to actually get vaccinated. So there's an example of how to use a qualitative data. Then also feedback mechanism, or to collect ideas or comments from vaccine manufacturers, medical staffs, and then other stakeholders. So you also want to know more information about, I mean, it's always good that vaccine companies are very open in terms of even material that go into making that vaccine. And that actually helped increase the trust the public come to have in that vaccine. And they should be able to spell out the side effects of the vaccine so that people know if I'm taking the vaccine, these are the possible side effects I should get. So getting some of these feedbacks and mechanisms from even the manufacturing companies is actually very important and is one of the ways of using a qualitative research. Then also culture, the individual culture evaluation about vaccination. Now, during this COVID-19 vaccination distribution, sometimes you might hear about people saying, my religion doesn't allow me to take COVID to be vaccinated, or maybe my culture does not allow me to be vaccinated. Now, it's very important to actually look into some of this culture values and then to be able to evaluate it and then to use it for policy intervention. Now, also more on, now let us look at qualitative data depends on problems you are working on. Now, most of the qualitative information depends on the problem you are working on and the hypothesis you actually come to formulate. So for example, one hypothesis you might actually formulate on how to work with a qualitative data on COVID-19 is if an individual vaccinated for COVID-19, what is the likelihood of the individual contracting other variant of COVID-19? So assuming through this, we are able to discover that when an individual takes COVID-19 vaccine, then the probability or likelihood of the individual contracting other variant of infection or COVID-19 is very minimal, then it even also become a motivation for people to go for COVID-19. And that's how you can structure your hypothesis to be able to investigate. Then also is having hypertension associated with depression. So there's also one way to actually formulate your question whenever you are embarking on qualitative research. You might want to know that individuals who are actually who are depressed, if you have people who are depressed and people who are having hypertension, you might want to know that, is it necessary that every individual who is depressed is at risk of getting hypertension? Then also, does the type of insurance enrolled depend on the level of, let's say, income, gender, or education? So sometimes you might want to know the type of insurance patients or an individual is using. And is this type of insurance influenced by the level of income of the individual? Is it so qualitative research actually allows us to assess disparities in generally. If you actually want to assess the disparities within a population, then you have to make use of what? Qualitative research, because it waters down and go deep into all information you might need in terms of even assessing disparities within a population. And also do socio-demographic factors influence surgical treatment of lung cancer? So there's also another way to formulate your hypothesis whenever you are searching qualitative research. Then also we have what factors are associated with heart-related diseases. So we might have heart-related disease, cardiovascular disease. So you might want to know what factors are associated with it. And that is also one way to actually go about with the qualitative research to be able to gather your data. Now let us look at some statistical tools for qualitative research. Let us start with descriptive. Now qualitative research doesn't have so many descriptive. Usually the descriptive is just minimal. So we have the frequency table, which gives you the count, the percentages, the relative frequency, the proportion, or the prevalence of the disease. And then we also have the cross tabulation. So again, cross tabulation allows you to be able to again assess the percentages, then the attributes by rows and then columns. Then also you have the mode of the mode which represent the most frequent attribute within that particular qualitative data. So now let us look at some visualization for qualitative data. So you have bar chart, or bar plot, which is actually used mostly in visualizing a qualitative data, and it display the percentages and then the counts of the attributes. Then you can also make use of the pie chart, which is also played similar role like the bar chart, giving us certain percentages or the outcomes of the attributes we are investigating. Then also we have the dot plot also performing similar role like the pie chart and then the bar chart, which is again also looking at the distributions in terms of the frequencies using counts. Then we have the classification plot, which is not actually quite often used, but however, it is used in a more advanced method, which is we have what is called the decision analysis. So you might want to know individual diagnosed with COVID-19, those who are not diagnosed with COVID-19, the likelihood of contracting COVID-19, the likelihood of not contracting COVID-19, their age group. So decision analysis actually gives you the node and then the branch to be able to make traces, to be able to make come up with conclusion. And there's a more advanced way to actually investigate. So finally, let's just look at some inferences in terms of this. So an inference you can actually perform, we have the test for sample proportion. It's one way to actually perform an inference for qualitative research. Maybe you might want to know that the proportion of individual, let's say the proportion of a male contracting COVID-19 is higher than the proportion of a female contracting COVID-19. So you might want to do that based on testing for sample proportion. Then quite often, what is most used often is the chi-square test, which is allow us to make the bivariate inferences that between two categorical variables. So you might want to know the association or relationship between two categorical variables. And using a chi-square test is one inference you can actually perform when it comes to qualitative data. Then also you have a logistic regression, which is even a bigger one. And there's the one which is used more often when it comes to assessing or investigating into qualitative research, given an outcome variable and then other independent or covariates. And logistic regression is also actually help you to be able to assess disparities within disease, within a disease outbreak or an outcome, given the risk factors or the covariates. So, okay, so that's it. So I'll call my colleague Cotton to actually send you through some of the database which you can actually use in assessing this qualitative research. So over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so getting back to the searching of the databases and how best to sort of locate these types of data. We find ourselves again, first looking at the general databases that don't necessarily have features which allow us to zero in on qualitative data. And so we start with the keyword searches. And as I mentioned before, qualitative is probably one of the ones I see most frequently in the students that I'm working with. The using qualitative as a keyword tends to work better than using something like quantitative because it, for whatever reason, is a little more specific, but it's still unreliable and it still will bring back results that might not fall exactly what you're looking, will fall into exactly what you're looking for. Again, consider alternatives that are related to the type of research. For instance, a keyword like attitudes, interviews, beliefs, perceptions, experiences. These are largely going to bring back results using qualitative research and data. And again, just as in the quantitative, thinking of how it's gathered and using those gathering methods as a keyword can be useful as well. So using a keyword such as observation or interviews or focus groups or surveys, again, open-ended, can be quite useful. These are also included as subject headings in a lot of the databases as well. So it's something to consider depending on which database you're using. Something like Google Scholar will not have that option. However, if you're using a search engine or a database such as OneSearch, then you will be getting subjects back as listed as focus groups. Once again, the specific analysis tools can also be useful. So thinking of using chi-test as a search term or logistic regression as a search term or a search phrase will bring back results that are using those specific tools most of the time. But like I did earlier, we have the general databases, which are particularly subject to using keyword searches. We also have the other databases, which have features built in to help us locate those. And once again, I'm going to bring up a browser and I will open up these databases as well. So we'll start with the same three that we just looked at with qualitative. And on CINAHL Plus, as I mentioned, there's a few different options. We can scroll down to the document type, but first we can also look at the clinical queries. Amongst these clinical queries, we do have the option to look at qualitative inquiries under a number of different sensitivity, specificity, and balance. So that is always an option to start with. We can also look at, again, the publication type here. And we can see right away something like anecdote. Anecdote is obviously going to be focusing on experience and can provide some qualitative data as well. We'll also see things like, these are very hard to scroll through, but we see biography is in there. There's also going to be case study right here, and interview will also show up in just about every possible document type. And so we can use those as well. But once again, I also do like to make use of these subject headings here. Instead of using the keywords, I'm going to suggest subject terms once again. And in this case, I can search with qualitative. And when I do that, we see qualitative validity and beneath that, qualitative studies. Now, qualitative studies is interesting because when I click on this link, it will take us to a hierarchy as we've seen in a few other areas. But in this case, unlike quantitative studies, qualitative studies has a number of specific types of qualitative research beneath it. This allows us to focus on that exact type of research. For instance, if I'm interested in phenomenological research, I can check that. And we will see the subject subheadings open up in here. However, in this case, I'm going to ignore those and just search the database. And upon doing that, we get back the 271 phenomenological research studies in this database. And as with before, we can also continue to narrow these down. If I want to use some of the features on that first main page, I can click on Show More right beneath the publication date. And it gives me all of those options from the first page. And so I might say, well, I'm looking for case studies, anecdotes, and interviews. And once I have those selected, I can click search. And we actually already had those in here. So we see publication type, anecdote, case study are both selected. So that is another way we can integrate both the subject headings and those features on the main page when we first log in. Okay, going over to APA PsycInfo, once again, we have a much clearer use of the limiters here because, as you may remember, we have a methodology option here. And under methodology, just like with quantitative, we can also select qualitative. And from here, we can certainly search and get back every possible qualitative study in this database, all 273,000. However, we would probably want to use keywords in here as well to get greater use out of these. Once again, we can also narrow these down by tests and measures as well, just to get a better idea of what they might be using. With PubMed, we're going to have a lot of the same functionality we had when searching for quantitative research. We can certainly use keywords, as I mentioned before, but we also might use the subject headings to our advantage, just as I do in the other databases. Now, once we're in the subject headings here, I'm still going to search for qualitative. And the top result we get back is qualitative research. We also see some very, very related subjects coming in after this, such as focus groups, which can be useful as well. But if I select qualitative research, it once again brings us to a hierarchy where we can observe this and then add it into our search builder and conduct a search, getting back 73,000 results. Another thing we might try is to use those keywords that I was mentioning earlier, not just to search as keywords, but to search for subjects as well. So if I go into the mesh database again, and I search for something like attitudes, we start to get a few relevant subject headings, such as attitude of health personnel, attitude to health, and attitude to death. These can be combined with other subject headings or just used on their own. For instance, if I select attitude to health and search for this in my search builder, we get back almost 500,000 articles just describing either patients or practitioners' attitudes towards health. And once again, we can use the article type limiter here to continue narrowing these down. Now, none of these, most of the options available here are more tied to quantitative research. But if I go into additional filters, it gives me the option to add several different types of articles. And so I might want to add, say, interviews and case studies, or case reports, excuse me. There's observational studies, there's interviews, there's several different options here, as well as personal narratives. And so I might select all these. Now, when I click show, this is not going to change the results, but we can see that these options have now been added to our article type options on the left. So if I am looking for articles about attitudes towards health and they're focusing primarily on interviews, I can select interview, and then that will update itself to 843 results. And we'd probably continue to narrow these down by date and maybe a few other options as well. But that obviously puts us on a much better start towards looking through these results. Okay, so those are the three databases, again, that I wanted to show you. Those have the most robust features for looking for these. However, some of these you will find do have some lighter limiters. Something like Science Direct can be useful in, say, narrowing down just to research articles. And then on top of that, you can use some of the keyword strategies that I mentioned earlier. And with that, we are at the end of our presentation. And so I'd like to open the floor up to any questions for myself or Professor Mamadou, and hopefully we can answer anything you might have. Oh, we do have a raised hand. Roxanne, if you can type your question into the chat, we'll certainly answer it, but unfortunately we can't turn the sound on right now. That is, by the way, completely my fault. I accidentally touched a screen that was not listed. So our question is, do you have any tips on how to conduct culturally sensitive analysis when it comes to conducting qualitative analysis? I'm going to defer to the expert here.
Yeah, so when it comes to conducting culturally sensitive analysis, there is actually, I don't have so much in-depth knowledge when it comes to culturally sensitive analysis, but what I can say is the fact that in order to perform a culturally sensitive analysis, sometimes you need to actually speak to a lot of experts because it's something sensitive. And getting hold of people's sensitive information is something which, I mean, you might want to take a very close look at. So I think when it comes to sensitive, culturally sensitive analysis, I think it's something, my research background is actually not too much focused on culturally sensitive analysis. So in this case, I would advise that I think speaking to someone who is more expert when it comes to handling culturally sensitive analysis research will be key. But however, it's also a form of a qualitative analysis. And then given that it is sensitive, it means you are actually gathering information more about individual issues about individual, which is more sensitive, right? So like I stated, I think it's something you might want to speak to an expert on this, particularly when it comes to culturally sensitive analysis. You have something to add?
No, I think.
Yeah, but that's a very good question anyway. Yeah, thank you very much. So any other question? So if there is no question, yeah, okay, so let's see. I think there's one question. Okay, so what program do you recommend for analysis? Oh, okay, so there's a lot of tools that can be recommended when it comes to analysis of qualitative data. Now, one of the tools in which I know public health or health personnel use most is we have the SPSS, which is generally particularly used in the university here by health researchers. And then also you can think of SARS. We have Stata as one of the tools you can use for qualitative data analysis. Then even we have tools like Minitab, even R, they are all tools which can actually be used for qualitative research. But like I stated, SPSS is quite more often because of its flexibility. You know, it's just point and click and then you get your results. So I can recommend SPSS for you, but SARS and then Stata and others are also the which also tend to be more flexible and then interactive. Thank you.
I would also mention in vivo as a good qualitative data analysis for text.
So any other question? So if there's no question coming, then we have a survey which is about this workshop. We will actually be grateful if you can actually go into the survey and then answer some few questions. It wouldn't take up to maybe 2 minutes to complete the survey. It actually gives us feedback and then it will guide us on future workshop of this form. So we thank you very much for coming. And do you want to say something more?
I would just also like to say thank you as well. If you could fill out the survey, that would be quite helpful. You can take a look at the survey and tell us if it's qualitative or quantitative after the fact. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day and a fantastic weekend. And we look forward to being able to provide workshops like this in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.